Ordered to hold at all costs, 300 American soldiers of the 110th Infantry Regiment found themselves defending the small snow-covered Luxembourg town of Hosingen during the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The situation was dire from the beginning. Cut off from reinforcements and surrounded by an enemy force that outnumbered them more than 10 to 1, the men of Hosingen stood their ground with remarkable courage. For 3 long days, the defenders endured unrelenting German assaults, waves of infantry, panzers, and devastating artillery that reduced the quiet town to smoldering ruins. Tanks rolled through the narrow streets, their shells setting houses ablaze, while the Americans fought from crumbling basements and shattered windows. They had been promised air and artillery support, but none came. Communications were spotty, reinforcements never arrived, and by the end of the 3rd day, their ammunition was nearly gone. Despite being effectively abandoned by the rest of the 28th Infantry Division, they continued to fight, buying precious hours for the U.S. Army to regroup and prepare its counterattack. When the last rounds were spent, and no help could possibly reach them, the surviving defenders had no choice but to surrender. Their stand at Hosingen, though ending in captivity, had delayed the German advance long enough to shape the coming battle. Captured deep behind enemy lines, these exhausted men began a new and harrowing chapter as prisoners of war. Forced to march for miles through snow and ice without food or rest, they endured unspeakable hardship at the hands of their Nazi captors. Many would not survive the brutal winter marches or the starvation that awaited them in German prison camps. Yet their defiance in Hosingen became one of the unsung acts of heroism that defined American endurance in the Ardennes. The story of Hosingen began months earlier with the battle-hardened 28th Infantry Division, whose journey through Europe had already earned them both respect and fear. Having landed on Omaha Beach on July 25, 1944, just after the initial Normandy invasion, the 28th entered combat near St. Lo 5 days later. There, amid the thick hedgerows of Normandy, they learned the brutal reality of close-quarters combat. The division's emblem, a bright red keystone, symbolizing its Pennsylvania National Guard roots, soon earned a darker nickname from German soldiers, the Bloody Bucket. The enemy believed the insignia reflected the division's ferocity, and the name stuck. On August 13th, Major General Norman Cota, the hero of D-Day's Omaha Beach, took command of the division. Under his leadership, the 28th pressed forward across France with renewed determination, moving faster but paying a steep price in casualties. Their courage and discipline, however, were undeniable. When the 28th reached Paris on August 25th, it was chosen to represent the U.S. Army in the city's liberation parade. The men marched proudly through the Arc de Triomphe and down the Champs-Élysées, cheered on by jubilant Parisians waving flags and tossing flowers. Yet, for these weary soldiers, celebration was fleeting. Only 8 hours later, they were back on the battlefield, once again facing German resistance on the outskirts of the city. Little did they know that just a few months later, they would face their greatest test yet in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, at places like Hosingen, Clairvaux, and Wiltz, where the Bloody Bucket Division would prove, once again, why its name was so well earned. Throughout September 1944, the 28th Infantry Division continued its relentless push across France, moving with an impressive average of 17 miles per day, despite stiff and determined German resistance at every turn. The division carved a path through the French countryside, liberating towns and villages, and engaging in frequent skirmishes with enemy rearguards and fortified positions. Their rapid advance carried them across the border into Belgium, showcasing both the strategic skill of the division's leadership and the tenacity of its soldiers. On September 11th, after weeks of arduous fighting, the 28th became the first Allied unit to reach the German frontier, a significant milestone that underscored their effectiveness and the high cost they had paid in manpower and material. Following 2 months of continuous combat, the division was finally sent to the rear on October 1st for much-needed rest and recovery. During this brief period away from the front lines, the 28th received thousands of replacements, intended to replenish its depleted ranks. These new recruits, fresh from training camps, would soon face the brutal reality of combat, with many destined to experience their first and only battles in the dense and unforgiving terrain of the Hurtgen Forest. The seasoned veterans of the division, hardened by months of fighting, regarded the newcomers with quiet apprehension. Many refused even to learn the names of the replacements, aware that the harsh realities of the forest campaign meant that numerous newcomers would be wounded or killed before the unit had the chance to integrate them fully. On November 2nd, the 28th Infantry Division replaced the 9th Infantry Division in the Hosingen Forest, entering a zone of relentless combat that would test the soldiers to their limits. The forest was a nightmare of dense trees, frozen mud, and hidden German fortifications. The men faced a relentless barrage of machine gun fire from well-positioned bunkers, anti-personnel mines, mortars, and devastating tree bursts. Each engagement exacted a terrible toll on the men's bodies and spirits. Freezing temperatures, snow a foot deep, and inadequate winter clothing compounded the hardships. Many soldiers suffered frostbite and respiratory illnesses, further reducing the division's combat effectiveness. Between November 2nd and 14th, the 28th reported 4,939 casualties, a staggering number that included 4,238 infantrymen, a testament to both the intensity of the fighting and the unforgiving nature of the forest. The 110th Infantry Regiment, in particular, bore the brunt of the losses. Originally numbering 3,202 men, the regiment suffered 2,316 casualties, including 65 killed in action, 1,624 wounded, 253 captured, 288 missing, and 86 non-battle casualties. Within the regiment, K Company experienced some of the highest losses. Of the 65 soldiers killed in the regiment, 21 were from K Company, a unit that had been part of the original landing forces in Normandy in July. By mid-November, only 6 men remained in K Company who had survived the forest campaign, leaving the unit almost entirely destroyed. On November 14th, the division was relieved by the 8th Infantry Division and sent to a quieter section of the Ardennes Forest, about 60 miles south, for rest and rebuilding. K Company, 110th IR, was reassigned to Hosingen, Luxembourg, a town that would soon become infamous during the Battle of the Bulge. Of the original members of K Company who had endured the Hosingen Forest, fewer than 20 men survived, and only 20 combat veterans returned to duty during the month. The rest of the company's 160-man strength was almost entirely composed of replacements, highlighting both the devastating cost of the Hosingen campaign and the incredible resilience required to rebuild the shattered division for the battles yet to come. The 28th Infantry Division's experience in Hosingen exemplified the brutal reality of World War II's European theater. Even units with an illustrious combat record could be brought to the brink of annihilation in the unforgiving terrain and under relentless enemy fire. Yet, the survivors carried on, their losses a stark reminder of the price paid for every foot of ground gained. Hosingen, a small Luxembourg town just 4 miles from the German border, sat precariously along a ridgeline that stretched for 10.5 miles, forming a key sector held by the 110th Infantry Regiment. The town itself was surrounded by 5 company strongpoints, and the Ober-Eisenbach, Hosingen, Droffelt Road cut through the area, connecting the Our River, the natural boundary with Germany, to Bastogne, Belgium. 2 bridges over the Klurf River, at Droffelt and Wiltz, provided vital crossing points, making the area strategically significant. Confident in the intelligence reports that claimed the Germans were incapable of launching any major offensive at this stage of the war, Allied commanders permitted units along the front line to pull back into the town each night, giving the men a false sense of security. Within Hosingen itself, the garrison consisted of several specialized and combat units. K Company formed the primary defensive element, supported by the 2nd and 3rd platoons of M Company, the heavy weapons company of the 3rd Battalion. Additionally, the 2nd platoon of the 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion provided a critical anti-tank capability with 3 57mm guns and 3.50 caliber machine guns, strategically positioned at the crossroads south of town on Steinmauer Hill. A contingent of 125 men from B Company, 103rd Engineer Battalion, was also stationed in Hosingen, responsible for maintaining the roads to ensure smooth movement of troops and supplies. These engineers were no mere support force. They had at least 8.50 caliber machine guns mounted on trucks, giving them some combat capability. Adding to the garrison's diversity was a small raider unit of 20 men, trained in scouting, patrolling, and reconnaissance, though the exact organization of this detachment remains unclear. In total, the Hosingen garrison numbered 387 enlisted men and 13 officers, all tasked with holding a critical position that, unbeknownst to them, would soon be at the center of one of the largest German offensives of the war. On November 8, First Lieutenant Thomas J. Flynn took command of K Company, assuming responsibility for establishing a defensive perimeter around Hosingen. Flynn and his officers faced an immediate challenge. Many of the new replacements had no combat experience, and he was hampered by the fact that supply runs delivered only a single day's worth of ammunition for training purposes. Despite these limitations, Flynn pressed forward, drilling his men in basic defensive maneuvers and preparing them for what they hoped would be a routine garrison assignment. On December 6, former company commander Captain Frederick Fiker returned to duty, with Flynn assuming the role of executive officer, providing continuity of leadership and experience. Throughout December, K Company observed an increasing number of German troop movements and reconnaissance patrols across the Our River, indicating that something significant was brewing on the eastern bank. Yet, despite these warning signs, the company's commanding officers largely dismissed the intelligence, failing to anticipate the scale or immediacy of the threat. What the Allies did not realize was that Adolf Hitler was preparing a massive counteroffensive, intending to replicate the stunning surprise of the Ardennes campaign from 4 years earlier. He assumed that the 110th would offer minimal resistance, clearing the way for his forces to punch through the middle of the regiment's positions with relative ease. By mid-December, Hitler had assembled an enormous striking force, 250,000 soldiers, supported by hundreds of tanks and self-propelled artillery pieces, along with thousands of trucks and logistical vehicles, all poised to launch an assault that would engulf the garrison and plunge the Ardennes back into intense and bloody combat. The men of K Company, along with their supporting units in Hosingen, were thus unknowingly standing at the epicenter of a storm, their preparation and courage soon to be tested under conditions of extreme pressure, isolation, and overwhelming enemy numbers. The town, its bridges, and its ridgelines would become the first line of resistance against one of the most ambitious German offensives of World War II, and the soldiers stationed there were about to face the unimaginable horrors of being outnumbered, outgunned, and abandoned behind enemy lines. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, VGD, of the 5th Panzer Army was widely regarded as one of the best infantry divisions in the German army, rigorously trained and battle-hardened. Comprising roughly 12,000 men, the division was tasked with a mission of immense strategic importance, to overrun the positions held by the 110th Infantry Regiment and open a pathway for the German advance through the Ardennes. The division's plan was ambitious and precise. Hosingen had to fall on the first day of the offensive, as its capture would provide control over the surrounding roads and ridges, including the critical bridges over the Klurf River at Droffelt and Wiltz. From there, the German forces were to continue eastward, seizing Bastogne by the end of Day 2, thereby clearing the path toward the ultimate objective of Antwerp, one of the Allies' key ports. Any delays, even minor, could provide the Americans precious time to reinforce Bastogne with additional units, potentially stalling or even derailing the German timetable for the offensive. Recognizing the importance of immediate success, the Germans assigned an entire battalion specifically to ensure Hosingen fell without resistance on the opening day. On the evening of December 15th, the first hints of the impending assault reached K Company. Soldiers stationed at the southern outpost, OP, reported the faint hum of engines emanating from the direction of the Our River, signaling the approach of German units. Soon after, the men in Hosingen were startled by a display of German ingenuity and intimidation. Searchlights pierced the darkness, sweeping across the low winter clouds and illuminating the town and its ridgelines almost as clearly as daylight. The eerie brilliance of these lights made the enemy's presence undeniable, and it created a psychological tension that only heightened the garrison's awareness. Sensing the gravity of the situation, Captain Frederick Fiker ordered the relocation of the company's mortars to new firing positions, a tactical adjustment that would prove crucial in the coming hours. These changes ensured that the mortars could cover key avenues of approach and provide the only artillery support the isolated defenders would have against the overwhelming German onslaught. As midnight passed and the hours of December 16th approached, the Germans quietly prepared to strike. By 0300, elements of the 26th VGD began crossing the Our River in rubber boats, hidden under a dense blanket of winter fog. Their approach was silent, methodical, and nearly undetectable, allowing the troops to assemble on the west bank and position themselves for the artillery barrage that would precede the main assault. By 0530, the American defenders were still unaware of the full scope of the attack. Soldiers stationed at the OP atop the water tower in the northeast corner of Hosingen had just called in routine updates to their commanding officer when they spotted hundreds of pinpoints of light flickering in the eastern distance. These were the German forward units preparing for the attack. Within seconds, the calm of the early morning was shattered by a torrent of artillery shells exploding across the town and surrounding ridges, instantly severing all wire communications and isolating units from one another. K&M companies sprang into action, each man rushing to his pre-assigned defensive position. M Company's 2nd Platoon and K Company's 3rd Platoon held positions at the Hosingen-Burrier intersection, roughly 1.5 kilometers south of town, while a squad from the 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion's 2nd Platoon took up positions on Steinmauer Hill, approximately 200 meters south. These outlying positions, though critical for delaying the German advance, were now completely cut off, leaving only about 300 men to defend the town itself. The concentration of enemy troops, the loss of communication, and the dispersal of friendly forces meant that the defenders in Hosingen were about to face an overwhelming enemy assault alone, with limited support, under conditions of extreme stress, and against an opponent who had meticulously planned to exploit every vulnerability in the American lines. The stage was set for a battle that would test the courage, training, and endurance of the 110th Infantry to its absolute limits. Private William Gracie and the other soldiers of K Company's 4th Heavy Weapons Platoon awoke to chaos, scrambling from their makeshift bunks as the first blasts of the German artillery echoed through Hosingen. They grabbed their weapons on the run and dashed out of the buildings they had been calling home, hearts pounding with adrenaline and fear. Their foxholes, positioned near the 1st Platoon's Northern Observation Post, OP, were only a short distance away, but the recent snowmelt had left them partially flooded and coated with ice, making movement treacherous. Lieutenant Thomas J. Flynn dove into a foxhole behind 1st Platoon's machine gunners, while Lieutenant Bernie Porter took his position with the 2nd Platoon at the south end of town. The initial German artillery barrage had already ignited 5 buildings, casting an eerie glow across the ridgeline and illuminating the battlefield as if in daylight. Flynn later recalled the surreal scene. The town was pretty well lit up, a chaotic prelude to the violence that would follow. By the time the bombardment finally ceased, 45 minutes later, 2 more buildings were ablaze, and the defenders noticed that artillery shells had struck locations where company mortars had been positioned earlier that day. Miraculously, none of the GIs had suffered casualties during the initial shelling, though the noise and destruction had set every nerve on edge. In the dim pre-dawn light, the sound of enemy troops moving could be heard to the north, yet visibility remained too poor to determine their numbers or precise locations. As daylight broke, shadows and movement along Skyline Drive became clear, prompting Lieutenant Flynn to issue the order to open fire. The defenders responded with a coordinated barrage of rifle, Browning automatic rifle, bar, machine gun, and mortar fire, effectively disrupting the German assault before it could fully coalesce. Sergeant James Arbella, leader of K Company's 60mm mortar section, climbed the water tower to provide precise firing coordinates to 4th Platoon mortar crews. The resulting mortar strikes, combined with concentrated small arms fire, inflicted severe losses on the advancing 77th Grenadier Regiment, forcing the surviving German soldiers to retreat and leaving a grim trail of dead and wounded along the approach. However, not all American positions fared as well. The OP on Steinmauer Hill was overrun during the initial German push, cutting off American units stationed to the south. Some soldiers managed to retreat westward, while others continued to fight fiercely, ultimately being killed or captured. Amidst the chaos, Captain William Jarrett climbed the village's church steeple to act as an ad hoc forward observer. From this vantage point, he relayed precise targeting information to Lieutenant James Morse's M Company 81mm mortars, which succeeded in temporarily halting another German assault coming in from the south. Desperately needing reinforcement, Captain Feiker requested artillery support from Battery C, 109th Field Artillery Battalion, stationed due west of the ridge. Unfortunately, the battery itself was under attack and unable to respond, leaving the defenders of Hosingen to rely solely on their mortars and small arms. Even the engineers under Captain Jarrett had yet to arrive to bolster the town's defenses, leaving a critical gap in firepower that the Americans had to compensate for with sheer determination, ingenuity, and courage. This opening engagement demonstrated the extraordinary resilience and improvisation of K Company and its supporting units. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the American defenders leveraged every available weapon, coordinated fire across multiple positions, and held the line with remarkable discipline and tenacity. The fires burning across the town, the sound of rifles and mortars, and the shadows of German troops moving through the streets all combined to create a scene of relentless combat, a baptism of fire that would define the gallantry and sacrifice of the soldiers defending Hosingen. German troops managed to infiltrate the southern outskirts of Hosingen, signaling the beginning of a desperate and brutal struggle for the town. In the chaos, American soldiers captured a German officer carrying a detailed map outlining the German attack plan all the way to Bastogne. This critical intelligence was of little immediate use, however, as the town was surrounded and heavily outnumbered, making it impossible to transmit the map to Colonel Hurley Fuller, the 110th Regiment's commander stationed in Clairvaux. Recognizing the danger, Captain Frederick Feiker contacted Major Harold Milton, the 3rd Battalion CO in Constum, to inform him of the deteriorating situation. Milton's response was firm. The defenders were to hold their position at all costs, and L Company, held in reserve near the regimental command post, would bring ammunition to support them. Yet L Company became embroiled in its own battle and never managed to reach Hosingen, leaving Feiker and his men entirely on their own. Despite severe disruptions to the division's communications, enough information reached Colonel Fuller and Major General Norman Cota for them to comprehend the magnitude of the German assault. Realizing that the 110th's frontline positions were mostly surrounded and cut off, Cota ordered Fuller to have the regiment hold and fight it out at all costs. To provide some reinforcement, he also dispatched Companies A and B of the 707th Tank Battalion to move toward Clairvaux to support the beleaguered troops. Meanwhile, the defenders at the southern outpost, OP, at Hosingen-Burrier remained a formidable fighting force. The initial German artillery had largely missed its intended targets, and the Americans successfully repelled the first assault, capturing 3 German officers, whom Private Dale Gustafson was tasked with guarding in a nearby barn. Anticipating a possible attack from the west, Captain Feiker prepared his defenses accordingly. Major Milton directed Captain Jarrett and the engineers to follow Feiker's instructions. Lieutenant Carey Hutter and 1st Platoon dismounted their .50 caliber machine guns from vehicles and took up defensive positions on the western approach, bolstered by M Company's mortars. The engineers shared their limited ammunition with K Company, and in a creative defensive measure, they linked 8 landmines in a daisy chain across the main street, hoping the first German tank to enter from the west would trigger them. Meanwhile, Private Frank Kosick was stationed in the church steeple armed with a bazooka, ready to target approaching armored vehicles. On the southern front, Lieutenant John Pickering and 2nd Platoon provided coverage, supporting Feiker's command post and defending the southern roadblock. 3rd Platoon, under Lieutenant Charles Devlin, took positions along the northeast edge of town, coordinating with Flynn's 1st Platoon and defending the water tower. Central command for the defense was established in the Hotel Schmitz, where Captain Jarrett and his engineers coordinated efforts. Each team was tasked with laying mines on all approaches to Hosingen, creating layers of obstacles to slow the German advance. By 15:15 hours, 1st Lieutenant Richard Payne led the 3rd Platoon of a company, 707th Tank Battalion, south along Skyline Drive from Marnock. Around 1600, Payne's tanks entered the north end of Hosingen to enthusiastic cheers from 1st and 4th Platoons, providing a crucial morale boost. Payne quickly organized his tanks into defensive positions. 3 tanks, accompanied by infantry, moved to Steinmauer Hill to disrupt German traffic along the Obereisenbach Road, while his own tank covered the southern road out of the village. A fourth Sherman was stationed to guard Skyline Drive to the north. At the same time, German pioneers completed the construction of bridges over the Aar River at Gemund, Dasburg, and Obereisenbach, allowing German armor to begin crossing in force. The defenders of Hosingen proved far more resilient than the Germans anticipated. By 1700, General Heinz Kokott ordered 3 panzers from the Panzer-Lehr Division and part of his division reserve, the I Battalion, 78th Grenadier Regiment, to join the assault on the town. 2 German panzers appeared on the high ground at Steinmauer Hill, forcing the American Shermans to withdraw into Hosingen, though they continued to lob shells at the advancing Germans, periodically racing back into position to provide fire support. West of the water tower, Sergeant John Forsell, a 1st Platoon squad leader, watched his machine guns lay down devastating fire, cutting swaths through German infantry attempting to infiltrate the village. Small groups of enemy troops continued to push into the town under the cover of night, resulting in vicious hand-to-hand combat that persisted until roughly 2,200 hours. Lieutenant Flynn personally engaged in one of these skirmishes, killing a German officer and retrieving vital documents from his body, which he reported to Captain Fiker. Even as the night wore on and direct combat waned, German patrols probed the edges of the village, testing the Americans' resolve. Miraculously, the defenders suffered relatively few casualties given the intensity of the fighting. From their positions, the GIs could see neighboring towns to the north and northwest burning brightly, illuminated by the fires of German shelling and occupation. The defenders' resilience, strategic use of limited resources, and quick improvisation had bought them precious time and inflicted significant losses on the German attackers, foreshadowing the heroic stand that would define the Battle of Hosingen. General Troy Middleton, commanding the U.S. 8th Corps, gradually came to the grim realization that the Germans had launched a massive attack along his entire 80-mile front. His 4.5 divisions were suddenly facing the equivalent of 4 times their number in German divisions, creating a precarious and desperate situation. Understanding the strategic implications, Middleton recognized that his only viable course of action was to delay the German advance as long as possible, buying critical time to move reinforcements into the Ardennes, and more importantly, into the key crossroads town of Bastogne, which stood directly in the path of the enemy's drive. He reinforced the standing orders to the 28th Infantry Division, emphasizing that they were to hold at all costs, with a particular focus on the 110th Infantry Regiment, the primary obstacle between the Germans and Bastogne. The men were aware that their role, though dangerous and potentially fatal, was crucial to the success of the larger campaign. As daylight broke on December 17th, the Germans renewed their assaults with ferocity, diverting additional Mark V Panther tanks and Mark IV medium panzers southward to flush the stubborn Americans out of Hosingen. The town became a scene of chaos and destruction. At Hosingenbarrier, a tank shell tore through the wall of a barn where Private Dale Gustafson was stationed, knocking him off his feet. Moments later, a second blast hurled a heavy iron cauldron from the fireplace at his head, rendering him unconscious. When he came to, the grim reality struck: his platoon had been captured. Remarkably, the German officers he had been guarding instructed their grenadiers not to harm the Americans, citing the respectful treatment they had received. By 0900, German tanks resumed their relentless artillery bombardment, setting more buildings ablaze, including the central command post at Hotel Schmitz, forcing Captain William Jarrett to relocate his operations to the basement of a nearby dairy to the west. The American defenders, though battered, refused to yield. As soon as the artillery fire ceased, German infantry began a ground assault. Mortars operated by the GIs destroyed 3 enemy tanks outright, while 2 others smoldered, abandoned by their crews. Anti-tank mines strategically placed by the engineers detonated under advancing German infantry, while fallen grenadiers, unremoved from the battlefield, were crushed beneath the treads of their own tanks as the German forces attempted to push forward. Fighting raged for over an hour, and the Germans were eventually forced to pull back, frustrated by the resilient American defense. Desperate for reinforcements, Captain Fiker managed to contact Major Milton via radio, requesting artillery support. The reply was grim: the 109th Field Artillery Battalion had been forced to retreat across the Klurf River, leaving Hosingen's defenders isolated. The Americans had no choice but to rely on their own courage and resourcefulness. The Germans attempted subterfuge by sending 2 half-tracks down Skyline Drive as decoys, hoping to draw American fire and reveal the Northern Sherman's location. Flynn and Payne's men held their fire, maintaining discipline. Meanwhile, the GIs stationed in the water tower spotted 2 Panther tanks concealed to the northwest, a position from which they could have destroyed the Sherman if it revealed itself. At 1300, the Panthers opened fire on the water tower, severing the telephone line and cutting K Company off from its defenders there. Recognizing the urgent need to restore communications, Sergeant Lloyd Everson sprinted several hundred yards through open snowfields, rifle in hand and bullets kicking up beside him, to reconnect the line. Once inside the tower, he verified that the telephone was operational, re-establishing the vital link. The German assault intensified as 6 more Panthers and Mark IVs from the 2nd Panzer Division arrived from Marnik, bringing the total number of German tanks at the northern edge of the village to 8. Captain Fiker attempted to deploy bazooka teams against the armored threat, but enemy small arms fire made it impossible to move beyond the village's perimeter. Fighting continued relentlessly throughout the afternoon, with Germans who breached the outskirts engaging in hand-to-hand combat, gradually reducing houses, shops, and hotels to rubble. The American supplies of rifle ammunition dwindled, and 1st Platoon's machine guns and mortars were destroyed, leaving the defenders dangerously low on firepower. The water tower, the last strongpoint for K Company's northern defenders, came under attack next. Inside, Sergeant Everson found a wounded lieutenant and a few remaining men, all preparing for what could be their final stand. Climbing the tower's stairs, he looked out the window to see infantry advancing, supported by tanks. Exchanging fire with the approaching Germans, he could feel the heat of their bullets as they passed, sizzling in the snow on the floor, a chilling reminder of how close death had come to each defender. In this brutal fight for survival, the soldiers of Hosingen displayed remarkable courage, discipline, and determination, holding the town against overwhelming odds as the larger Battle of the Bulge unfolded around them. The situation inside the water tower had reached a critical point. A German tank, determined to eliminate the stubborn defenders, fired 2 rounds at the tower, both of which exploded harmlessly outside. Not satisfied, the tank repositioned itself a short distance away, pivoting its gun to take another shot. Inside, Sergeant Lloyd Everson continued to fire at the advancing German soldiers, keeping one wary eye on the tank. The next shell struck just as the last round from his rifle clip was expended, the force of the explosion blowing him down the stairs. For a moment, Everson lay stunned on the floor, disoriented and unable to see or hear properly. The concussion of a second shell rattled the tower, and his mouth was filled with the acrid taste of cordite. Desperately trying to regain his senses, he popped his eardrums to hear anything at all, blew his nose while holding it shut with his hand, rubbed the tears from his eyes, and came face to face with a German machine pistol trained directly on him. A medic arrived just in time to bandage the wounds of both Everson and a nearby lieutenant, after which they were removed from the tower. Looking at his watch a few minutes later, Everson noted it was 1,615 hours, a grim reminder of how long the firefight had been raging. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Thomas Flynn's 1st Platoon command post had a clear view of the chaos unfolding at the water tower, but his men were embroiled in their own intense struggle elsewhere in Hosingen. With his radio damaged, Flynn had no way to communicate with Captain Frederick Fiker, leaving the situation at the northern end of town completely unknown to command. Understanding the urgency, Flynn made the perilous decision to run the gauntlet from his position 650 meters south to Fiker's CP, navigating the rubble-strewn streets of the village. German tanks and small arms fire raked the streets, one tank even attempting to target him directly. Yet because of its limited angle, it could not depress its gun enough, allowing Flynn to dodge artillery blasts and machine gun fire, moving from cover to cover until he reached the pharmacy building at the center of town, where Fiker had established his command post. By dusk, the Germans had successfully penetrated portions of Hosingen, and the battle devolved into brutal house-to-house fighting and hand-to-hand combat. Most of the American defenders gradually regrouped to the center of town, but smaller units found themselves isolated and cut off, forced to fend for themselves amid the chaos. As they withdrew from exposed positions, the GIs improvised, setting booby traps to slow the German advance, ignite fires, and inflict casualties. These fires illuminated the surrounding fields, giving American snipers and riflemen valuable lines of sight, though the Germans continued to advance relentlessly. Despite the defenders' determination and ingenuity, the numerical superiority of the German forces meant the village increasingly filled with enemy troops, tightening the noose around Hosingen while the remaining Americans fought desperately to maintain their positions. The streets of the village had become a deadly maze, where every house, corner, and alleyway posed the potential for sudden violent encounters. The defenders' resolve was being tested to its absolute limit, their courage and discipline the only barriers preventing the town from being completely overrun. The battle for Hosingen had transformed into a fight of attrition, where even the smallest acts of ingenuity, rigging a door with explosives, shooting from a hidden window, or holding a single street intersection, could determine who survived the day. Captain Frederick Feiker gathered his weary officers in a dim, smoke-choked room to take stock of a grim reality. Scattered pockets of GIs were cut off, their ammunition nearly exhausted, and only 3 serviceable tanks remained to hold a town that swarmed with German troops. There was no artillery support and no relief force on the horizon. Payne's Sherman scraped together a hasty perimeter around Feiker's command post, but the perimeter was fragile and the men were bone-tired. At 0200 hours on December 18th, a determined band of 16 grenadiers surged at Jarrett's command post. Jarrett's men beat them back, but the cost was immediate and personal. Lieutenant Slobodzian was dispatched to check on positions with a report due, only to be struck down by enemy fire, bullets tearing through his left arm and left leg before he could move far. Carried to the aid station in the village church, he bled under the care of Corporal John Putz, B Company's medic, who fought to keep him alive, binding wounds and administering morphine. But by 0300 there was no plasma left, and both Slobodzian and Sergeant Lawrence Gronfeld, who had been hit the day before, were slipping into shock with little that could be done. Outside, the Germans shifted fires toward the church, directing withering small arms and tank fire at the building where Staff Sergeant Norman Gunter and Master Sergeant Joe Winchester's engineers crouched over the wounded. Jarrett crept from the dairy under their covering fire close enough to lob a grenade over a side street wall to silence a sniper nest. The town was a furnace of collapsing timbers and burning thatch, heat stabbing through wool and frozen air. Most American vehicles had already been gutted. At 0430 Feiker reached Milton by radio and outlined the desperate calculus. His men could not break out in daylight. Milton at last ordered an escape if possible, but, hearing Feiker, conceded it was too late. "We can't get out," Feiker answered, "but these Krauts are going to pay a stiff price." Milton, his voice heavy, finally told him to act as he saw fit. The officers met and weighed the options. With the mission of delay accomplished but the force encircled and bleeding away, Lieutenant Flynn argued that surrender now offered the only plausible chance for survival and to avoid the fate K Company had suffered in the Hurtgen forest. Feiker yielded to the grim logic. The order went out to destroy everything of value to the enemy. Flynn removed his .45 Smith & Wesson, smashed it, and left to oversee the demolition. Maps, records, vehicles, and equipment were torched or smashed, weapons ruined in such fashion that repair would be difficult, radio sets slated to be destroyed last. Feiker radioed Milton to report their decision. Milton's curt, compassionate sign-off, "You have done your job well. Goodbye and God bless you," hung in the air like a benediction. By 0900 German snipers and tanks renewed their pounding. White flags were run up and scrap panels draped across Shermans, and the Germans fell silent. Feiker and Jarrett walked into the open field together to surrender to a colonel of the 78th Grenadier Regiment. They were marched back at gunpoint to a town in smoldering ruin. Minutes later, at 1000, Lieutenant Morse managed one last, ragged transmission to Milton CP. "We're down to our last grenades. We've blown up everything there is to blow up except the radio, and it goes next." A note of raw defiance crept into his voice. "I don't mind dying. I'll be damned if we'll give up to these bastards." And then, with an act of bitter finality, he shot the radio dead with his .45. At 0955 Major Milton sat back, the watch on his wrist ticking toward a hollow hour. His men in Hosingen had held 5 more hours than any relief could have expected, and now they were gone from the line, their sacrifice bought with blood and stubborn courage. The American GIs, weary, frostbitten, and bloodied from days of relentless fighting, were ordered to exit their shattered positions with their hands placed firmly on their helmets and to assemble in front of a nearby church. Staff Sergeant Norman Gunter hesitated, fearing the chaos and uncertainty outside, while Private William Hahn, overcome by exhaustion and stress, fainted. His comrades were powerless to help him, as the German guards would not allow any intervention. Moments later, the GIs heard Hahn's anguished screams emanating from inside the church as the Germans entered, and he was never seen again, leaving an indelible sense of dread among the men who had survived the battle. As the American soldiers filed into the street, the German troops looked on in astonishment. They could hardly comprehend that such a small surrounded force had fought with such ferocity against overwhelming numbers, inflicting significant damage while suffering relatively few casualties. The sight of disciplined, defiant Americans contrasted starkly with the expectation that the town would have fallen quickly. All the officers could do was observe in silence as their men were subjected to humiliation and indignity, shouted at, slapped, thoroughly searched, and stripped of valuables. Enlisted soldiers were compelled to trade their sturdy combat shoes or galoshes for the inferior German boots carried by the enemy, a bitter irony amid the chaos. Tension escalated as a pair of German MG-42 machine guns were mounted and trained directly on the American prisoners. A misfire tragically killed 2 men, and Private John Neck was wounded in the forearm, yet the German captain intervened, reprimanding the responsible gunner. Captain Jarrett later reflected that this act of discipline likely saved countless lives, preventing a massacre from occurring in the heat of the moment. Meanwhile, Corporal Sam Miller narrowly avoided execution by leaping behind the blade of a parked bulldozer, though a German soldier quickly leveled a gun at his head to force him back into the line. The Americans could not avert their eyes from the grim tableau. Lifeless bodies lay scattered across the street, pools of blood slowly darkening the snow and mud. The American officers were separated from their men and marched to an isolated house at the southern edge of Hosingen. There, one by one, they were stripped of personal effects, searched, and interrogated. Lieutenant Flynn, fluent in German, served as an interpreter when needed, helping his fellow officers communicate. The interrogation lasted roughly an hour, with the Germans chiefly focused on details about the locations of minefields, booby traps, and other defensive measures that could impede their continued advance. Meanwhile, some of the enlisted men were moved behind the church to a drainage ditch, lined up under machine gun fire with bulldozers ominously waiting nearby, as it became clear that they were moments away from execution. Fortune intervened when a German staff car arrived, and an officer shouted orders that saved the prisoners from certain death, directing them to return to the road and march to a field on the east side of town where they would await others. Sergeant Winchester, still processing the narrow escape, quietly whispered to Corporal Miller, "We put on a heck of a show, didn't we?" The remaining enlisted men were moved into open fields where they were forced to assist in the grim task of tallying and searching through the dead and wounded. Medic Wayne Erickson and Staff Sergeant George McKnight were pressed into service to help bury approximately 300 fallen German soldiers and care for wounded prisoners until arrangements could be made for hospital transport. Despite the harsh weather that had grounded most planes in the days prior, a spotter plane's report of the intense shelling at Hosingen the previous day prompted several American fighter planes to arrive in the area to provide air support. In a tragic miscalculation, the pilots mistook the American POWs in the field for German soldiers. They strafed the ground relentlessly, killing and wounding several of the surrendered men. As the American planes conducted their assault, German aircraft appeared, pursuing the Americans from Bastogne, and the prisoners found themselves witnessing a violent dogfight overhead. One American plane, struck by enemy fire, erupted in flames but continued to unleash its machine guns as it spiraled downward. Tragically, some of the men in the POW assembly below were killed in this sudden fusillade. The doomed aircraft crashed nearby in a fiery explosion, leaving no survivors and serving as a stark reminder of the chaos and indiscriminate violence surrounding the men of Hosingen. The survivors were left shaken, witnessing not only the consequences of their own surrender, but also the merciless randomness of war, their endurance through days of battle culminating in a grim, surreal aftermath of fire, blood, and shattered human lives. Around 1,500 hours, the battered and exhausted American prisoners of war were forced to march along the Ober-Eisenbach-Hosingen-Drofelt road toward Eisenbach. Even after 3 days of intense fighting, the road remained congested with a ceaseless flow of westbound traffic supporting the massive German offensive, including supply convoys, armored vehicles, and artillery. The POWs arrived at Eisenbach roughly an hour later, only to be herded into a small, cramped church. Inside, they were pressed tightly together on the cold, hard floor and the wooden pews, with only sparse straw providing minimal insulation or comfort. Captain Jarrett, selected by the Germans as the senior officer of the group, was abruptly removed and marched away for further interrogation, leaving the men to try, with great difficulty, to get some much-needed rest after 3 sleepless days and nights of combat. For medics Wayne Erickson and Staff Sergeant George McKnight, sleep remained a fleeting luxury. They would spend the next 4 months on brutal forced marches across Germany, moving from camp to camp, enduring severe weather, meager rations, and constant exhaustion. Their ordeal would finally end only on April 12, 1945, when they were liberated near Hosingen, Germany, having traveled more than 900 grueling miles under enemy control. The capture of the American soldiers at Hosingen was part of a far larger wave, as roughly 23,000 Americans were taken prisoner during the Battle of the Bulge. The sudden influx of prisoners forced the German authorities to split the Americans into separate groups once they reached train stations, with enlisted men sent to stalags and officers to offlogs. The prisoners from Hosingen were distributed among several camps across Germany and Poland. Enlisted men were commonly sent to Stalag IXB at Bad Orb, Stalag IVB at Mulberg, Stalag VIA at Gorlitz, and other stalags, while officers were taken to Offlog XIIB at Hammelburg. Non-commissioned officers were sent to Stalag 9A at Ziegenhain, and a small contingent of American Jewish soldiers and selected non-Jewish NCOs were later sent to Berge am Elster, a slave labor camp near the notorious Buchenwald concentration camp. On February 8, 1945, the 350 Americans transferred to Berge am Elster were forced to dig tunnels for an underground ammunition factory, enduring grueling labor in brutal conditions. Private Clifford Williford of M Company was among this group, which suffered a 20% fatality rate, accounting for 6% of all American POW deaths during World War II. Remarkably, out of the approximately 300 defenders of Hosingen when the Battle of the Bulge began, only 7 men had been killed and 10 wounded, despite facing overwhelming German numbers, armor, and artillery. The small contingent of Americans had inflicted an estimated 2,000 casualties on the enemy, including over 300 killed. Hosingen represented the final town held by the 110th Infantry Regiment before it fell to the Germans, and the stubborn defense provided critical time for the U.S. First Army to rush reinforcements to Bastogne on December 18, 1944. Among the reinforcements was the renowned 101st Airborne Division. Without the determined stand at Hosingen, the story of Bastogne, and the broader campaign in the Ardennes, might have unfolded very differently. The courage, discipline, and sacrifice of the men of the 110th Infantry Regiment had not only delayed a superior force but had directly contributed to the survival of Bastogne and the eventual American counteroffensive, leaving a legacy of extraordinary heroism in the annals of World War II. The brave men who fought in Hosingen would never again come together as a single unit, bound by the camaraderie and shared experiences of their harrowing stand. Their order to hold at all costs came with a staggering price. They endured unimaginable hardships as prisoners of war, suffering from extreme starvation, untreated wounds, disease, and exposure to the harsh winter conditions. Most of the men lost at least a quarter of their body weight, weakened by the combination of malnutrition and relentless physical strain. Many were confined in overcrowded sealed boxcars for days at a time, subject to bombing and strafing by Allied aircraft unaware of their presence inside. Others were forced to march hundreds of miles from one camp to another across Europe, battling frostbite, exhaustion, and illness in what was recorded as one of the coldest winters in modern history. Only a handful of these soldiers managed to escape or survive the grueling conditions, yet all carried the scars of those harrowing days for the rest of their lives. After liberation by the Soviet Red Army at the end of January 1945, the extraordinary courage and sacrifice of these soldiers did not go unnoticed by their commanders. Colonel Hurley Fuller, commander of the 110th Infantry Regiment, submitted a nomination for the unit, alongside the 109th Field Artillery Battalion and Company B of the 103rd Engineer Battalion, for the War Department's Distinguished Unit Citation, now known as the Presidential Unit Citation. The nomination highlighted their pivotal role in defending the Ardennes region during the German assault from December 16 to 18, 1944. Despite the undeniable heroism and strategic impact of their actions, the request was inexplicably denied in 1946, much to the astonishment of the officers who had fought in the region and witnessed the remarkable results, including General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division. Over the decades, several additional attempts have been made to persuade the U.S. Army to reconsider its decision, yet all have been unsuccessful. One of the enduring tragedies is that, due to the destruction of unit records before their capture, there is no complete official list of the men who fought in Hosingen during those fateful 3 days. The personal sacrifices of these soldiers, the men who stood their ground against overwhelming odds, inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy, and bought crucial time for the defense of Bastogne, remain largely unrecognized in official military history. Today, efforts continue to honor and document their courage. If you know of someone who fought in Hosingen, Luxembourg, from December 16 to 18, 1944, the author Alice M. Their story is a testament to human bravery, perseverance, and the high cost of duty in the face of overwhelming adversity.